that which accepts or bears God, like in the case of the cross, becomes holy, right? I mean, we call it the Holy Cross, and we venerate it, we revere it. It has a special place among our people, not because it's a pretty symbol or because it's, made of the best wood or whatever it was. It's because of what happened on that cross, and specifically that Jesus Christ, the incarnation of God, the Son of God, went up on that cross. He physically touched it, and he did this great saving act on that cross. It's not something to be sort of just discarded or taken lightly. There's a holiness that dwells within that sacred object.
So it is my distinct pleasure to get to introduce tonight's speaker, Der Stephan Baljian. I had the privilege and pleasure of being a classmate with Der Stephan a few years back at St. Nerses. So Der Stephan is a native of Springfield, more specifically Indian Orchard, Massachusetts, and he graduated from Antillas Theological Seminary in 2003, after which he joined us at St. Nerses for several years, and he graduated from St. Nerses and St. Vladimir's seminaries in 2006. Der Stephan was ordained to the priesthood in 2008, and he currently serves as the pastor of St. Gregory Armenian Apostolic Church in North Andover, Massachusetts. He has been published in the St. Nerses Theological Review, as well as in the Treasury. He is a member and past commander of the local Knights of Vartan Lodge. He is an incredibly accomplished musician. He's a trained classical pianist. He's a composer. He is a singer, and these things really inform his theology and his ministry in beautiful ways. In addition, you may not know this about him, but he enjoys genealogical studies and is quite accomplished in those as well as the history of historical villages of Western Armenia. He is married to the most lovely Yeretskin Alice Baljian, and they have 3 children, Nishan, who's 11, Hovannes, who's 9, and Mariam, who is 2. And you may get the privilege of hearing one or more of them during tonight's presentation. So if you hear young voices, that's who they are. Der Stephan is going to be talking about the God-bearing cross tonight, which should be a really interesting presentation. As a reminder, I ask that you hold your questions until the end. There will be time for questions, and I will remind us all of what our question and answer policy is when we get to that point. So unless our presenter asks for feedback during the presentation, please hold your questions until then. And please be sure to put yourselves on mute. Without further ado, Der Stephan, welcome.
Thank you, Deacon Yervant.
Oh, and with that, we will invite you, Der Hayr, to offer the opening prayer as well. Thank you.
Խնամող արարածոց բահյան նշանավ խաչիկոս հոգի եւս մարմինի իբադրանած մեղած իփորձությանց թիված եւ իմարտոց անիրաված եւ համենայն վտանգից հոգվո եւ մարմնո եւ ողորմյա քո արարածոց եւ ինձ բազմամեղիս, you who care for all creatures, with the sign of your cross guard my soul and body from the deceptions of sin, from the testing of evil spirits, from unjust people, and from all dangers, physical and spiritual. Have mercy upon your creatures and on me, a manifold sinner. Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. I'd like to just take a moment to say thank you to VEMCAR, to the entire committee, to my former professor, Professor Roberta Irvin, and to my classmate, Deacon Yervant, and to all the support staff. This is a wonderful program that you have, and I am honored tonight to be part of your series of speakers for this season. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Tonight's topic is the Holy Cross that bears God, an exploration of the Holy Cross as the bearer of or showcase for the divine. So we start tonight with just a little bit of review, and I know that some of these facts, these little tidbits, are going to come up from now and then in your studies this semester. But I wanted to talk about them a little bit. I wanted to be open about them. First, that the Armenian Apostolic Church with the Holy Cross, both in form and function. That means the conceptual aspect of it and the reality of it. The Armenian Apostolic Church has more feast days dedicated to the Holy Cross than ancient Christian tradition. That should be evident to all of us by now. That the Church has a rich tradition of hymnography, homiletics, poetic odes, and theological exegesis pertaining to the Holy Cross. In other words, there's been a lot that's been written about the cross. The Holy Cross is the essential sacred icon of the Church's tradition, occupying its art, sculpture, architecture, and many other artistic spaces. We're going to talk a little bit about this later too, that you can't go anywhere in an Armenian church or among Armenian faithful without seeing or signing the cross. You know, it's sort of the quintessential thing that reminds us of God, and it's our connection with God through Christ. And that's very important. And lastly, and I think probably, if not the most important, I think the most tangible in the sense of what the cross has meant for us over the centuries, is that the Armenian people have identified with both the concept and the reality of the Holy Cross through centuries of martyria, the Christian witness of co-suffering with Christ and martyrdom for the name of Jesus Christ. So we think about in our past, our history of persecutions, massacres, and even the genocide of later centuries. You know, this is not insignificant, superficial stuff. This is showing that we identify with the cross in a very real and very tangible way. Okay, so taking a look at the topic today, the Holy Cross that bears God. I think that this is sort of summed up in one word that we have that's used not all that often, come to find out, but in our texts, and that word is Asdvadzungal. And I believe that maybe one of the things that qualifies me to be here tonight is that I had published way back when I was a student at St. Narcissus, a piece of work, a writing, an encomium as it's called, by St. Gregory, known as or St. Gregory Nazianzen, who wrote in the 4th century a text about this Holy Cross that bears God, Asdvadzungal Surpach. We found a couple of interesting things about that text. When I say we, I was under the direction of Professor Urban. But to me, that's what sort of sums up what the concept is. It's in this word, Asdvadzungal. So in looking at this word, trying to define this word, I'd like to sort of do it through 3 avenues of approach. Sort of a philological approach. You know, what are we looking at here? What is the definition? How do we pinpoint what this word means? A rhetorical approach, looking at how it's used, how it's been sort of worked to propagate the idea that we're talking about tonight. And lastly, and most importantly, theological. What is the significance? What is the significance, not just of the word? The word is secondary. It's the concept that we're trying to understand tonight. So we start by looking at the root of the word, the etymology. So you have Asdvadzungal, and like I said before, I found it's sort of a somewhat elusive term in that it's used in quite a few different ways. And also in trying to pinpoint it in lexicons and dictionaries, there are several different definitions. They're sort of kind of all around the same theme, but they sort of dance around it in a circular fashion. We start with the root word God, which in Armenian, of course, is Astvadz. And we find this word in its infinitive form is ungalul, interestingly enough, which means to receive or accept. But we are familiar with this word in its imperative form, which is ungal. And this is a church word. This is a word that we encounter often in our liturgical texts, to sort of seal our prayer of Der Vohormia before we take communion on Sundays. The choir sings, Ungal der Vohormia, receive, O Lord, receive our prayer, in other words, and have mercy. But I'm going to also throw in also this word as well, which is just simply the word gal. Stand this word to be to stand, to hold. In its infinitive case, it means to be or to exist. It can be used that way, but it comes specifically from this sense of standing. And it's interesting that when we think of words that end with this as a suffix, gal, it's actually a stand for something that holds something or contains something. And it's one of the most beautiful words, I think, that we have in our language that I don't really think we're able to translate in any other way, and that is shnor hagal. Shnor hagal. In any other language, someone does something for you, you want to express your thanks, you just say thank you, thanks, or merci, or whatever language it happens to be. But it seems like Armenian is unique in you're trying to express this sentiment that you are a container of thanks. You are like a stand for the grace that was given to you. It's sort of a concept that would, if we really thought about it, would be hard to translate to somebody who wasn't familiar. So I just wanted to touch on that word, or the as a suffix, the understanding of gal. Also, gal, I believe, means a threshing floor as well. And that's where you get Gomidas Vartabed, for example, wrote several versions of a song, a traditional folk song called Gali Yerk. Gali Yerk, it was the threshing song. That's just a little tidbit. Okay, moving on. So in looking at the definition of this word, we consult the Nord-Kirk Haigazian Lesvi, which is sort of the seminal lexicon of the Armenian language, published in, I believe, 1836, and from which generations of scholars have received their education, so to speak, in the Armenian language. Up until at least my days in seminary, it was considered sort of a rare honor to come across a copy of this 2-volume book. I still remember where we had this set in the old library at the old St. Nerses when I was a student there. But I was lucky that a goddaughter of mine, actually, who traveled to Hayastan fairly frequently, had asked me one year, anything I can bring you back from Hayastan? I said, if you can find this particular set, I would be eternally grateful. And lo and behold, she came back with my very own copy of this lexicon. In the subsequent years, thank God, it's now available online, which is a wonderful resource. So I don't have to be in my office, let's say, to crack the book to figure out definitions for difficult words. So it comes highly recommended. It has the Greek and Latin equivalents of each word, each entry, and it also gives copious examples from the writings of the Church Fathers, liturgical writings, patristic writings, to show you the context of the word that you're looking at. So what the compilers of the NBHL, Nord-Kirk Haigazian Lesvi, came up with for this word, Asdvadzungal, it's a very short entry too, is Voro Ngalyale Hinkans Astvadz, Zinch Yeve Orinagav. That which has in itself God, whatever it may be, whatever the example. Okay, so right away we see this is a pretty broad definition, and I think it's open to a considerable amount of interpretation, whatever it is that has in itself God, however that happens, and whatever that might be. So it's not necessarily limited only to the cross or things pertaining to the cross. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind during the presentation tonight. Okay, moving on. In this same lexicon, it also gives several, I guess for lack of a better term, synonyms for the word to sort of cross-reference with. And they are Asdvadzungal, Asdvadzagir, Asdvadzaskiats, Asdvadzarial. So just to take a look very quickly, Asdvadzungal, that which contains God, that which has God in itself. And you could probably apply that to most words that end with unag. Asdvadzagir, I think I would probably be more comfortable with applying this term to bearing God, the cross that bears God, just as Jesus himself, bore the cross. That word would be gurel. That word that would be the root word that we would use to pick up something or to take on something or to bear something. Asdvadzaskiats, of or pertaining to God. In this word, we see the word ask, which means really of the family of something, being part of the nation of or the type or kind of something. And so that's why we have Asdvadzaskiats as a word. That's a word that sometimes actually shows up in some of our sharagans as well. And this was a word that I was less familiar with, this last one. This actually sent me on a little bit of a goose chase, flipping through the pages, well, clicking through the pages, excuse me. But it's Asdvadzarial. And I figured out, because again, all of these, well, we're going to get to this in a moment, but the question is, who is the subject here and what's the object? Is it the object that contains God, or is it God contains the object? And in this sense, is it Asdvadzarial? We understand, I believe, and maybe Professor Irvin could correct me if I'm wrong, but this arial suffix has to do with some kind of doing or creation. So the question begs, is it the cross that's manifesting God, or is it God that's manifesting the cross? That's the question that we come up against. And this word I thought was a little bit sort of ambiguous, but then I came to the conclusion that it really does pinpoint something that is sanctified or made divine by God, just by virtue of the fact that he is God. Whatever he has handled or touched or went up upon or whatever it is becomes Asdvadzarial. Okay, so try to keep in mind that there are some synonyms to this Asdvadzungal word as well, that all sort of pertain. It might have a little bit, like I said, kind of dancing around the same, the definition, but it all gives the same understanding. Okay, let's take a look now at the sort of the rhetorical aspect of it. How is this used? What is this word really trying to convey? What is the concept trying to convey? So we see that this word appears twice in the Divine Liturgy. There are two prayers that are inserted at the beginning, and they come from a special section of the evening hour, the Yere Goyan Jam, that's called Chrad Vasen Yergerbakutian Surp Yegeretzvo, or the rite of bowing down of the Holy Church. Now, talk about ambiguities. That begs the question, are we talking about in the church? Are we talking about of the church as the people, the church as the sacred space? There's a lot of sort of things that I certainly have questions about. Maybe Tanyel Sirpazanhaid would be the one to ask about that kind of question. But suffice it to say that during that little rite, it's like a little addendum at the end of the evening service, we see there's a specific phraseology that says Arachi Asdvadzungal Yev Baidzaratsial Sup Neshanatzis. It actually appears in three prayers. One of them is by itself, and there's two that are actually somewhat optional from what it seems. So essentially the rite starts outside the door, and the first prayer begins Artaranan Surp Yegen, at the gates of this church. or at the door of this church, Yev Arachi Asdvadzungal. In other words, this phrase. And then there's also, and this will be more familiar, and this is what I have here as our text, Imech Dajaris. So now the people are somehow inside the temple, inside the church. Imech Dajaris Yev Arachi Asdvadzungal Yev Baitzaratsial Supnashanatsis. And then right after that, in its place in the evening hour, is another variant of this same prayer, which is I Hargi Serputian Yevider Voches Parapanutian, which makes reference specifically to being on the altar. And it's those two prayers that are back to back in the evening hour that we have they're spaced out appropriately at the beginning section of the Divine Liturgy. One in the middle of the chancel in front of the altar, which is Imech Dajaris, and the other after the celebrant and the altar servers have ascended the altar. They say this is essentially the same prayer, just the opening statement is different. The opening reference to where they are, which is I Hargi Serputian Yevider Voches Parapanutian, which means upon this altar of holiness and in this place of worship. But essentially, we see this same formula throughout those three prayers, and two of them made their way into the Badarak, or to the Divine Liturgy. So we're going to take a look at several translations now of this line. And I did some reaching back pretty far, as you can see. Going back to 1867 in a translation that was published in Venice at the Monastery of St. Lazarus Island, the Mukhitaris, where it is translated as follows: within the precinct temple and in the presence of these sacred and divine emblems, bowing in the holy place, we adore with trembling, etc., etc. So I've put in bold here what I believe the translator is using to denote this word Asdvadzungal. The second comes from Divine Liturgy of Amy Apkar. Amy Apkar, for those of you who don't know, was a choir director in Calcutta, India, and she published several exhaustive, massive volumes of church music that also contained all kinds of, well, first it contained all the written text, as well as translation into English, and all kinds of charts and different rubrics, like a field day. If someone wanted to study the liturgical practice of that place at that time, the late 19th century, let's say in the East, in places like India, or even in New Julfa, which I believe the Indian community had stemmed from. I think to this day, historically, the Diocese of New Julfa sometimes is still referred to as Iranahant Kastanitem, the Diocese of Iran and India, essentially. So this Divine Liturgy of Amy Apkar, which actually was published before the Divine Liturgy of Magar Yegmalian, in case anybody wanted to have a little bit of a factoid there, a little tidbit. She writes, or whoever translated, I should say, wrote, in the midst of this temple and in the presence of these God-accepted and glorified symbols, and so on and so forth. So here we have an attempt to sort of directly translate, looking at the just, very, very basic level, Asdvadz and Ungal, God accepted. And notice the use of a hyphen there, because we're going to see another one in just a moment where there's no hyphen included. From an unattributed translation found online. So the translator of that one is out of luck, unfortunately. In the midst of this temple and before these holy symbols accepted by God and glorified, and before this holy place, we humble ourselves and bow down in fear, and so on and so forth. So here we have, I think, just another thing God accepted. It's accepted by God. But in this case, the premise is that God is the one that is doing the accepting. In other words, the symbol, which we understand because the word is nishan, we understand that to be the symbol or sign of the cross. I'm by the way, I'm very familiar with that name. I don't know if many of you might not know this, but that was actually my baptismal name, was Nishan. So at the time I was a student at St. Nerses, and I was named after my father, who was also named Nishan until he became a priest and was renamed Derantranig. And he had two grandfathers, a biological one and a step-grandfather, and they were both named Nishan. And now my 11-year-old son bears the name Nishan as well. So just a little anecdote from me. So we see, again, God accepting these signs. Then we have an interesting translation done by Father Theotoros der Isahagian, whom I noticed was actually the subject of some writing, some article written by Tanyel Surpazan that's available on the Zorab Center website. He was a very interesting figure, and he served at one time in the United States, and also his travels and studies brought him to Calcutta at one time too. And he writes, in the midst of this temple and before these God-accepted and glorified tokens and of this holy place, etc., etc. Fast forward a few years, in 1960, a translation done by a man named Jirair Misakyan, published by Heidenik Press in Boston. In the midst of this temple and before these resplendent, by Zaratzial, that's probably a good translation there, holy symbols accepted by God. So here we're kind of, you know, again, moving the syntax a little bit, you know, God accepted, God hyphenated accepted, accepted by God. And then we're going to see the hyphen here again. This is the one that we have in our pew books today in our Churches of the Eastern Prelacy, published in 2008. In the midst of this temple, O Lord, and before these God-accepted and resplendent holy signs, and before this holy place, we bow down in awe, and so on and so forth. So again, we have to ask ourselves, and it's probably beyond the scope of what we're doing tonight to try to come to a concrete conclusion, but we have to ask ourselves, what do all these variations mean? Again, do the signs, the nishank, themselves accept God? Like, you know, we could probably draw a conclusion that that's what sacred means in one of the translations. Or are they accepted by God? Do they accept God? Are they accepted by God? And we could even go even further to sort of view the concept in a more existential state. Is it that they are acceptable to God? I mean, certainly we would argue theologically that the cross itself was acceptable to God. Jesus Christ sort of somehow deemed it worthy to suffer and to die by that means, by the cross, not any other means, let's say. So there's sort of that underlying question that goes throughout this whole investigation. Now we're going to look at yet another variation, and I think this is probably the one that's most interesting. This is from Archbishop Diran Nersoyan's translation, which was published by the Eastern Diocese, I believe back in 1999. This is the one that most of you will be familiar with from the pew books, from when you visit your churches every Sunday. And this was actually edited by, at that time, Hayrsurp Tanyel, and now Tanyel Surpazan. And I think I lost the page here, sorry. This is worded the following way. In the midst of this temple, Lord, and before these holy signs, and before this holy place that hold God up to us, and are made resplendent, we bow down, and so on and so forth. Now, I remember having this conversation with then Hayrsurp in our liturgical theology class, and maybe Deacon Yervant, I think we probably were in that class together, and maybe you remember this, but I remember the question coming up of, is it Asdvadzungal, or was Archbishop Diran's take of blessed memory, his take on it, a little bit different? And I remember specifically that the question that was put in front of us was, what about this other way of forming the word, which is Asdvadzun gal. Remember, we talked about gal being to stand or to hold. And essentially what that would do would be to add a definite article, I guess, the n at the end, and it would essentially change the word. And it's interesting, the more I thought about this, because this all raced around in my head for a while I was preparing for this talk, it drastically changes the word and the definition, or I guess the meaning of the word, the definition, I should say. But when you really think about it, it doesn't change the meaning of the word all that much. So you see a total difference in the understanding of the etymology and the structure and how you parse the root words Asdvadzungal versus Asdvadzungal. But in the end, I don't really see a huge significant difference in the meaning. One would essentially be saying, that thing which accepted God, and the other would be saying that thing which presented or bore God to us. And I think that's what Archbishop Nersoyan of blessed memory, using it within that context, that's why he translates that. I don't know if that's his original. I didn't have his original. I know it was published several times to go back and look. But I know that in the latest version of the text, and this could have been some of Tanya Sukwadan's doing it as well, but he uses this phraseology, the holy signs and the holy place that hold God up to us. Again, it's a different approach, but it's not saying anything all that different. I also did some thinking about this as well. It's a nice concept that it would be Asdvadzungal. However, I couldn't find any other words in the classical Armenian language that use this construct with Asdvadz at the beginning of the word. Every other word is basically Asdvadza something, like Asdvadza ser, Asdvadza gir, Asdvadza hajo, for example. These are all compound words that you make with the word Asdvadz. I even learned a very interesting tidbit. There is actually a word, it's a verb, Asdvadzadem, which I guess translates as the act of hating God. So I hope that none of us ever get to that point. Okay, moving on. So let's take a look at some of the places where this Asdvadzungal word or concept shows up. I was able to find it in approximately one of our hymns. Out of all 1,166 of our hymns, and again, I did some spot checking. I didn't go through with a fine-tooth comb and look at all 1,166. But I found it in one. And we actually, those of you who were in church, hopefully, and for those deacons and acolytes, choir members, hopefully you remember singing this just a couple weeks ago. It's from the Vohormia Sharagan, the Sharagan that's based on Psalm 51. That's sung in the morning office, but also sung on the Feast of the Holy Cross of Mount Varak, Varakachachi Don, that is sung during the Vadarak, for the Jashu Sharagan. Does anybody remember the name of this Sharagan? Anyone remember singing it within the past few weeks? Okay, some of you are nodding heads. Okay. It's Kez Christosi Gatoige Yegretsvoshton Hohi. Yeah, I'll spare you, I won't sing it for you. But the text is Tzachdagan, Azbatvagan, Asdvadzungal, Surt Nashant. So that word is there. And notice again, it's used with Nashant or Nashant. The word also appears several places in the collection of litanies, odes, and melodies known as Kansaran. This is probably one of the least familiar liturgical books that we have in our liturgical tradition. Certainly, I would guess that the gospel would be the most familiar to all of us, but we have liturgical books like the Mashtots that contains all of our sacramental services. The Jamakir, which contains the daily prayer hours for the day. We have orthodox, which contains, it's the priest's euchologian. It contains all of the prayers of the Divine Liturgy for the priest to use. But one of the rarest and maybe least known is a book called Kansaran. It's sort of kind of I like to look at it as like the unauthorized guide to the Armenian Church. We have, canonical prayers, hymns. We have a lectionary that has all of the scriptural readings and all of the psalms that are used throughout the liturgical year. And the Kansaran sort of gives us a little bit of a B-side to all of that. It has certain odes and different hymns, meretis, songs that were written not in any kind of official, they're not used in any kind of official capacity. They're read from sometimes during special services, or when the monks were eating dinner in the monastery refectory. They were sort of seen as a supplement to understanding the meaning of whatever particular day, feast day that it would be. However, I should say that a great many of these odes and melodies sort of trickled their way into some of our extra traditional things. Like, for example, when the curtains close during the Divine Liturgy, during the Badarak, there's like umpteen number of meretis or odes, kansk, that are made, that are available for people to sing. And a lot of those come from the book called Kansaran. And it's there, it's not a highly used term, but it's there on several occasions. And probably the most well-known is an ode called Chachini Nachnuman Yerevetzav. It's a beautiful ode, it's very fun. It sort of talks about all the ways that the cross sort of pre-shadowed or prefigured the salvation of Jesus Christ, starting at the beginning with Adam and Eve and moving throughout the centuries. It says, like, Enoch Numan, at the beginning, the cross, appeared this way. And then the second time, the cross appeared as Noah's Ark. And the third time, the cross appeared as the staff of Moses. And it goes all through history until it actually gets down to the very end. And it says, in the last, the cross will appear, and it will be the forerunner, the sign that presents the second coming of our Lord. It's really great. Highly recommend it. Okay. The word Asdvadzungal in the patristic texts. We have several patristic text titles that use this word. The earliest that we have is the encomium on the Holy Asdvadzungal cross by St. Gregory Nazianzen, or known as the Theologian, which would date from the 4th century. However, I think we did conclude that the authorship is doubtful because it only appears in Armenian texts. It doesn't appear in any other tradition. And there's some other issues with it too, but suffice it to say that that's the conclusion we came to. There was two similar encomia that were written on the same subject. One of them written by Theotoros Kurtenavor, which means of the camel garment, which means he wore a very uncomfortable garment of camel hair. And that was in the 7th century, and also a figure named David the Invincible Philosopher, and that was in the 8th century. There was also a sermon for the burial and resurrection of Christ our God from the Asdvadzungal tomb, as one of the few places that we see the word not used with the cross. So the tomb also received or accepted God. And that is written by Theophilos, who was alternately listed as 9th century, but also listed as a disciple of St. John Chrysostom, which the math there doesn't quite add up because Chrysostom lived at the end of the 4th century. And just to draw your attention, this encomium by St. Gregory the Theologian, in my translation, under the direction of Professor Irvin, appeared in volume 11, 2006 of the St. Narcissus Theological Review. There I am there, Stephan Baljian, during my seminary student days. Okay, so lastly, let's get to really what the theology means. What is the significance of all of this? We talked about sort of the wording, the philological aspect of it, the rhetorical aspect, how it's used, what it's trying to convey, but what's really the theological significance of all of this. So we saw these several meanings, right? Accepted by God, or sacred, accepting of God, God accepted, or God bearing, right? The last one we saw that lift God up to us. What does this all mean? You know, that question still is something that God accepted, or did the Nishank, did they accept God? Well, here's the answer. I'm going to go with D, all of the above. And I came to the realization after probably thinking about this maybe one too many times over the past 16 years, that it really doesn't need to be a one or the other type of approach. I think we have a rich enough theological tradition, and I think we have a wide enough span of thinkers in different time periods and expounding upon different types of theological concepts, that I think it's safe to say that, you know, whether it's the cross that accepted God or God that accepted the cross, I think it's a little bit or a lot of both. I think that all of those definitions can be seen in that word, and more specifically, more importantly, in the concept. That which accepts or bears God, like in the case of the cross, becomes holy, right? I mean, we call it the Holy Cross, and we venerate it, we revere it. It has a special place among our people, you know, not because it's a pretty symbol or because it's, you know, made of the best wood or whatever it was. It's because of what happened on that cross, and specifically that Jesus Christ, the incarnation of God, the Son of God, you know, went up on that cross. He physically touched it, and he did this great saving act on that cross. It's not something to be sort of just discarded or taken lightly. There's a holiness that dwells within that sacred object. Likewise, that which God accepts becomes holy. I mean, that's one of our theological teachings, is that, you know, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was a holy, acceptable sacrifice. You know, thinking prophetically, you know, back to the 51st Psalm, you know, Badarak Astdzo hoki chonar, sirtsu pevas hoki chonar, Asdvadzungal arahamare. You know, the sacrifice acceptable to God is a humble heart and a contrite spirit God will not refuse. And, you know, we see that embodied and encapsulated in the act of Jesus Christ on the cross. I mean, it couldn't ask for any more of a humbling act. And St. Paul talks about this in second chapter of his letter to the Philippians as well. You know, he was God. He's, you know, the divine, you know, second person in the Trinity. He's equal in very nature to God, and that became a theological point of our church as well. But he emptied himself, totally humbled himself, and that becomes this acceptable offering to God. That which lifts up or showcases God itself becomes holy. I mean, we see that in all the places that we see the cross in our church. You know, when we're standing in front of the altar, when we're standing in the building, the cross is there. It's constantly showing us and reminding us of God, and it's holy for that reason. You know, anything that shows us God. I mean, we look at how we react. You know, we react with reverence. We kiss in front of the cross, or the chachkar. You know, we make the sign of the cross. So the end result is the same. The Holy Cross is worthy of our veneration and to be considered holy by us. And that's by virtue of God having dealt with it. You know, God in the person of Jesus Christ having made that a part of his encounter here on this earth. So I went over some of these already. You know, God the Son was crucified on the cross. But also, too, the one thing that we shouldn't forget was that the cross was seen as the prefigurative sign of salvation, you know, which is, it's brought about through Christ's death, but it's seen not only, you know, from the time of the crucifixion forward, but it's seen all the way back, like we said, all the way to the Old Testament, like Jacob's vision of the ladder, Moses' staff parting the Red Sea. You know, I can hear the Sharagan texts already. Yerev yal agyusanaman agan badvagan itsev chachin, hertzanelov zoben garmir. It's like literally saying Moses is standing there with this staff that literally is the cross, and that's what he's parting the Red Sea with, and because it prefigures our salvation. The cross appeared in Christian history as a sign of God's power. Thinking about like Constantine at Milvian Bridge, the apparition of the cross over Jerusalem. Just a couple weeks ago, we celebrated a miraculous vision of the peace of the true cross that the monk Totik had at Varak. So it's really, and also that the cross is the tangible space of Christian worship as well. Our churches are shaped like crosses. They're adorned with crosses. The doors, the centerpiece of the altar, everything, you name it. Our whole experience is sort of steeped in the cross. So to draw some conclusions, the Holy Cross is important in all of these multiple aspects to the life of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Like we hopefully came to the conclusion, somewhat, this Holy Cross can be seen as Asdvadzungal, as a long-standing part of the sacred tradition. And that Asdvadzungal Holy Cross has been defined according to a number of different terminologies or definitions, but ultimately it means that it has been made holy by its encounter with God, and by extension, the people have been made holy by their encounter with it. And finally, let's not forget, it's it's always great to look back and look to our history, but let's remember that the Holy Cross has a vital role in the life of our church today, and that's both during this season and at all times. Sometimes we get a little bit too nostalgic, I think, as Armenians. We like the ancient aspect, the antiquated aspect, let's say, of our church, but we have to remember that our faith is for today. If it's not a faith that's living in us today, it's really not a Christian faith. So let's remember to carry that message about the cross and what it means to us, at all times throughout our life. And I'm ending here with this line from that ode from the Kansaran. We place our trust in that wood to which the Lord Jesus was affixed, and in humility we bow down to this sign which received and bore God. Mek yahain pait dem kusatsial horder Jesus peveretsav yev chonarial yergerbakemk Asdvadzungal surt nishanis. Thank you.
Son of God, true God, who descended from the bosom of the Father and took on a body from the Holy Virgin Mary for our salvation. You were crucified, buried, and rose from the dead, ascended in glory to the Father. I have sinned against heaven and before you. Remember me like the penitent thief when you come with your kingdom. Have mercy upon your creatures and on me, a manifold sinner.
Thank you, everybody. Again, thank you, Dedhide. And just a quick reminder, if you look in the chat, Vartan has provided us with the daily prayer rule for the season of the cross. This can be a really useful devotional item that you may want to avail yourselves of. Again, wonderful to see everybody. So wonderful to have you here tonight, Dedhide. We look forward to seeing you again here next week, all of you, same time, same place, for another exciting presentation on the cross. Until then, be safe, be well, and good night or good morning, as the case may be.